Welcome back to the Deep Dive Podcast. I'm Eric, and joining me as always is Anna.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be back because today's topic is honestly one of the biggest ongoing challenges across the GMP world right now.
Absolutely. Today we're talking about data integrity in GMP operations and why so many pharmaceutical and biotech companies still struggle with it despite years of regulatory guidance, digital transformation efforts, and increased inspection scrutiny from agencies around the world.
And I think what makes this topic interesting is that a lot of companies assume they're in good shape simply because they implemented electronic systems or updated a few SOPs. But data integrity issues usually go much deeper than that. A lot of the problems are tied to operational habits, oversight gaps, documentation practices, and how quality systems actually function day to day.
Exactly. And regulators have made it very clear over the last several years that data integrity is no longer viewed as some isolated compliance initiative. It's directly tied to GMP compliance, product quality, and ultimately patient safety.
And honestly, that's where companies start getting into trouble because these issues rarely stay isolated for very long. What starts as one small gap can quickly expose bigger operational weaknesses underneath. Maybe it's a missed audit trail review, inconsistent spreadsheet tracking, shared user accounts, or weak documentation practices. Once you start pulling on one thread, you usually uncover several other problems connected to it. And from a regulatory standpoint, that raises concern pretty quickly because now inspectors are questioning the overall reliability of the GMP data.
That's exactly right. And our team at EMA International recently worked with a pharmaceutical manufacturer dealing with this exact type of situation. The company was growing quickly and implementing several new digital systems across manufacturing, laboratory, and quality operations. On the surface, things looked functional. Procedures existed, systems were in place, but internally they were starting to notice inconsistencies in how GMP critical data was being managed across departments.
And honestly, we see this happen all the time during growth phases. Companies expand operations quickly, roll out new systems, move into electronic platforms, and suddenly governance just doesn't keep up. You end up with a mix of legacy processes, manual workarounds, partially integrated systems, and inconsistent operational practices all happening at the same time. And eventually, those inconsistencies start creating compliance risk.
You're right. And in this particular case, the organization identified several areas of concern tied to data governance and operational oversight. There were incomplete audit trails in certain systems, inconsistent documentation practices between departments, uncontrolled spreadsheets being used for GMP activities, and limited oversight around manual data entry. Individually, some of those issues may have seemed manageable, but together, they started raising bigger concerns around data reliability, traceability, and inspection readiness.
And one thing regulators consistently look for is visibility. They want companies to clearly understand where GMP critical data originates, how it moves through the organization, who has access to it, and how changes are controlled over time. Because at the end of the day, regulators rely on that data to make decisions about product safety and quality.
Exactly. Another major challenge for this organization involved operational behaviors that simply hadn't evolved alongside current regulatory expectations. The company had quality procedures in place, but many day-to-day habits were still based on older approaches that no longer aligned well with current expectations around electronic records, audit trail review, user access management, and traceability.
And honestly, that's a huge point because most data integrity observations don't happen because companies intentionally ignore compliance. A lot of the time, teams are just operating based on habits that developed years earlier and were never fully reassessed as systems and regulations evolved. For example, people keep using spreadsheets because they're convenient operationally, even if those spreadsheets don't have proper controls or traceability, or broad user access stays in place simply because nobody ever revisited how the system was originally configured.
And over time, those types of practices create vulnerabilities that become harder and harder to defend during inspections. So, EMA International conducted a comprehensive assessment of the organization's overall data integrity framework. The assessment focused on governance structures, system controls, operational processes, documentation practices, and broader regulatory risk areas impacting inspection readiness.
And this is where organizations sometimes underestimate how complex data integrity remediation actually is. It's not just about updating SOPs or validating a system. You really have to evaluate how people, processes, systems, and oversight mechanisms all interact together across the operation. Because data integrity is operational, it touches manufacturing floors, laboratories, quality units, and support functions every single day.
That's exactly right. One of the first steps involved performing risk-based evaluations of GMP data flows across manufacturing, laboratory, and quality systems. The team mapped how data was generated, reviewed, transferred, modified, approved, and archived throughout different operational areas. And honestly, organizations are often surprised by how many manual interventions or uncontrolled processes exist inside workflows they assumed were fully compliant.
Absolutely. And once those workflows are mapped out, you can start identifying weaknesses tied to audit trails, user permissions, documentation practices, and manual processes. In this case, several vulnerabilities were identified involving inconsistent oversight of system generated records, insufficient audit trail review activities, and inconsistent procedural execution across departments.
And one important thing to point out is that the remediation strategy was built using a risk-based approach. The goal wasn't to create unnecessary administrative burden or pile on more procedures. The focus was on prioritizing the areas that directly impacted GMP critical data, product quality, and inspection exposure.
And honestly, that's where effective remediation becomes practical instead of just theoretical. Companies need solutions that strengthen compliance without completely disrupting operations. Because if remediation becomes too complicated or disconnected from reality, employees usually create workarounds, and that can create even more risk.
Exactly. As part of the remediation effort, EMA International also helps strengthen governance policies and procedural controls surrounding GMP critical records and electronic systems. That included improving oversight of user permissions, strengthening audit trail review processes, and standardizing documentation and record management practices across departments.
And governance is critical because training alone doesn't sustain data integrity. If nobody clearly owns the process, things start slipping fast. Audit trails stop getting reviewed consistently. Access controls aren't monitored properly. Deviations aren't escalated correctly. And eventually, the whole system becomes harder to defend during an inspection.
Without a doubt, another major component of the engagement focused on employee awareness and organizational culture surrounding data integrity. Because at the end of the day, even the best systems cannot compensate for poor operational discipline or a weak understanding of regulatory expectations.
And inspectors evaluate that now too. They're not just reviewing procedures anymore, they're watching how employees explain processes, how teams handle documentation practices, and whether management actively reinforces quality expectations. If employees seem uncertain about audit trail responsibilities or proper system usage, regulators often see that as a sign of broader cultural weakness.
Exactly. So, targeted training was delivered across operational teams, focusing on regulatory expectations, documentation practices, operational behaviors, and oversight responsibilities tied to GMP data. The organization also integrated data integrity principles into broader quality oversight activities and management review processes, so the topic stayed visible at the leadership level rather than becoming a one-time remediation project.
And leadership visibility really matters. Organizations with strong data integrity cultures usually have leadership teams that consistently reinforce expectations around documentation discipline, transparency, procedural adherence, and quality ownership. When employees see leadership prioritizing those behaviors consistently, it becomes part of the culture instead of feeling like a temporary compliance initiative.
That's a great point. The organization also conducted mock inspections and compliance readiness exercises to help teams prepare for potential regulatory interactions. And those exercises are valuable because they test more than procedural compliance. They also evaluate how confidently teams can explain processes, demonstrate oversight, and respond to inspector questions in real time.
Because during inspections, regulators are evaluating the overall control environment. They want to see consistency between procedures, systems, employee behavior, and management oversight. Any disconnect between those areas can raise concerns pretty quickly about the reliability of the GMP data.
And after the remediation activities were implemented, the organization saw significant improvements across multiple areas. Data consistency, traceability, and reliability improved throughout manufacturing and quality operations. Compliance risks tied to documentation practices and system controls were reduced. Employee awareness and accountability became much stronger. And perhaps most importantly, the organization improved overall inspection readiness and strengthened regulatory confidence in its quality operations.
And honestly, I think this situation highlights one of the biggest misconceptions in the industry. Technology alone does not solve data integrity problems. Companies can invest heavily in digital systems, automation platforms, and electronic records, but if governance, oversight, operational discipline, and quality culture are weak, the underlying risks are still there.
Absolutely. And as regulatory expectations continue evolving, organizations really need to view data integrity as an ongoing operational responsibility rather than a one-time compliance project. Because data integrity impacts everything from product release decisions and investigations to laboratory testing, manufacturing records, and ultimately patient safety.
And we're also seeing regulators place much greater emphasis on overall quality maturity now. They want to see organizations proactively identifying risks, continuously improving oversight processes, and building sustainable systems capable of supporting long term compliance. Companies that treat data integrity as part of a broader quality culture are usually much better positioned long term.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest mistakes companies make is assuming that the absence of inspection findings means the absence of risk. In reality, vulnerabilities can exist quietly within operational processes for years before they eventually surface during inspections, investigations, deviations, or major quality events.
Exactly. Which is why proactive assessments, governance reviews, employee training, and strong operational oversight remain so important. Organizations that continuously evaluate their data integrity frameworks are usually far better prepared to adapt to evolving regulatory expectations while maintaining operational control and inspection readiness.
Well said, Anna. And I think that's a great place to wrap up today's discussion. Data integrity remains one of the most important focus areas across GMP regulated industries. And while technology continues evolving rapidly, organizations still face ongoing challenges involving governance, operational behaviors, system oversight, and quality culture. At Emma International, we continue supporting pharmaceutical, biotechnology, and medical device organizations through practical, risk-based approaches designed to strengthen compliance, operational discipline, and long-term quality performance.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of the Deep Dive podcast. We hope this conversation gave you a clearer perspective on why data integrity remains such an important regulatory priority and what organizations can do to strengthen oversight within GMP environments.
And as always, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive podcast.